automatic adjustment mechanism. Another one, which is the one in the second column, which has been adopted also in several countries, is actually to link to the life expectancy, the benefit system. I have to say that this is not among our favorite one, at least from the European Commission perspective, because it's something that can hamper the adequacy of the system quite significantly, because basically, rather than accumulating earnings for the pension system, it's as could have the effect of reducing the benefit. So it's something that we do not really like. And likewise, also, any mechanism that automatically introduces a balancing system is not necessarily the most adequate, at least in terms of adequacy of the system. The other thing that I want to show is that one other thing that we need to consider when we look at how to redesign the pension system is the fact that in many countries, still today, the effective age to get in retirement is lower than the statutory retirement age. And why it is so? Because in many countries, there are still what we call early retirement schemes. And second, there are also a lot of special retirement schemes that very often are an inheritance of the past. We believe that both early retirement schemes and special retirement schemes, especially when they are not really justified by the current condition of the labor market, are very good candidates for redesigning the pension system and to be reformed. Now, one other thing that we do in our aging report is to consider what would happen under a number of alternative policy scenarios. So what I've been showing so far are the baseline scenarios, so scenario of what are the expected costs in the pension system at unchanged policy, so basically just enacting the reforms as they are now. But we have at least 3 alternative policy scenarios. The first one is a scenario where we assume that basically the gains in life expectancy are translated in a higher age to get retired with a factor of 3/4. And basically, according to this scenario, you can see that basically all the countries would have very significant saving in their public funded pension system. And just in case you wonder how comes that a few countries would not have a gain, is because those countries have this system already in place, so there is little to gain further. But otherwise, for all the other countries, linking the retirement age, the effective retirement age, to the life expectancy has the potential to really help, at least from a public finance perspective. A second scenario, which actually has an opposite message, is a scenario where we assume what would happen if the retirement age would be frozen at the level as it was in 2024, so when we published the report. So basically, this is a sort of a policy risk scenario where we assume that although there have been reforms and they have been legislated and adopted, they would either not be enforced, or even worse, and is something which unfortunately we are seeing in some of our countries, they are reversed because, it is known that pension reforms stay quite at bottom of the popularity of structural reforms. So in a scenario where the reforms would either not be implemented or even reversed, basically we see that conversely the cost of aging related to the pension system is projected to increase, and to increase quite a lot. And third policy scenario is a policy scenario that looks at the adequacy of the system. So here what we do, we assume that basically if the benefit ratio drops by more than 10 percentage points, the policymakers would intervene to prevent the adequacy of the system to fall further. And again, in this scenario, of course, the cost of the pensions, the public cost of pensions are expected to increase, and to increase significantly. Here the main message is that, as I'm going to say in the next slide, that when we think of how to redesign the pension system, we need actually to keep 3 dimensions in mind. We believe the sustainability of the public finance, which is actually the angle where I'm coming from, but at the same time, the financial adequacy of the system and the social fairness. And in terms of reforming the system, we believe that there are a few basic principles that should be followed. Of course, this is not a silver bullet, it's not the solution for everything, it's just ideas that I'm throwing. Of course, there is the basic principle that working more or longer should lead to higher pension rights, so indeed to establish a link between earnings and benefits. As I said before, any deviation from general rules, so early retirement schemes, special schemes, needs really to be reduced and well justified. Also because one aspect to be kept in mind is that the moment that one tries to implement a pension reform, keeping alive schemes from the past that basically are related to well-gone working condition actually hampers also the legitimacy of any pension reform that one would propose. Third aspect, which we believe is important, is to shift the mindset in the sense that we believe that we should not think anymore that people of the same age are equally old and equally unfit to work. We need basically to change our mindset and start thinking in terms of not only of life expectancy, which of course is important, but also career length. This is because current and future cohorts are expected to be more educated, which means with all likelihood that they will enter the labor market most likely later, but they have also the potential to stay longer, so to compensate less educated cohorts. And then reforms need to be introduced gradually to avoid cliff effects, especially between similar cohorts, widely supported and predictable. This is why basically we recommend very often to have changes that are automatic because to enhance predictability. I'm not going to dwell on the other aspects. We have heard already yesterday morning the importance of supplementary pension schemes. This is something indeed that needs to be looked at. And again, I will not go in any of the flanking policies also because I believe that many of the speakers after me will cover the flanking policies in other areas. So let me move then on healthcare and long-term care, which are the other two main drivers behind aging costs. So to start with the healthcare. Now, when we look at the relationship between the age of individuals and their use of healthcare, this is actually well displayed in this curve, which is the so-called age-related expenditure profile. What this chart tells us is that indeed the costs are, first of all, high in the very young age, then they become relatively high for women around the maternity age, but it is after the 50 years that basically the curve goes significantly high, which means that having an aging population will mean a greater proportion of population being in the more expensive categories. And actually, when we look at the determinants of the public healthcare spending, there are many factors. Of course, the population itself, the aging of the population, the structure of the population is the main factor, as shown in the previous chart. But there are many other factors, and I won't have the time to go in each of them, but just to give you a snapshot, an overview, we have factors on the demand side and factors on the supply side. On the demand side, as I will explain in a moment, the one thing, and we have already heard about it somehow already yesterday, the health status of the population is something that is going really to make a difference in terms of healthcare cost, the income, also the climate change. It's known that heat waves of course affect the oldest part of the population in a different way, so it's something that also will enter in the overall picture. And on the supply side, as we will see in a moment, the institutional setting, the availability of healthcare systems, the distance of these systems, the workforce presence, and actually, as I will say in a moment, the shortage of a workforce in the medical area is something that is being problematic. And then, of course, the technological developments, both in prevention, diagnostic, and treatment, are also things that will affect the spending in healthcare. Now, in the interest of time, let me move here. So first of all, at unchanged policies, we see that the public spending in healthcare is projected to increase by almost 10% between now and 2017 in the European Union, in the European countries. But what is interesting is that actually it will make a huge difference if the aging of the population, as we have heard yesterday, will happen under healthy or non-healthy condition. So basically here in this scenario, what we call a no-healthy aging scenario is a scenario where we assume that all the years gained in terms of life expectancy will be spent in some morbosity condition, while conversely, the health aging scenario assumes that all the years gained in terms of life expectancy will be healthy years. And here you can see that actually a healthy aging scenario has the potential to actually contain or at least maintain the aging cost almost stable. So building on what was said yesterday, of course, it's very important that longevity is healthy longevity for all the reasons that we have heard yesterday, but also because it's important from a public finance perspective. So this is the first message. The second one is that actually, while under the baseline, health costs are projected to increase by 10%, the increase could be much higher and worse in what we call a risk scenario, which actually projects past pattern in terms of both workforce and technological developments. Here, perhaps a word of caution. I'm not saying that basically the pattern of the past will replicate necessarily in the future, but what is true is that what we are seeing in terms of technological developments for both prevention, diagnostic, treatment, although cost-effective, is still very expensive. All the innovations that we are seeing are still very, very expensive. So from a perspective of public finances, they are going to wait on public finances. And as I will say in a moment, also the shortage in the workforce is something that needs to be actually taken care of. So based on this, what we normally recommend in terms of redesigning the healthcare system, well, first of all, here, I can just repeat what has been said very strongly yesterday, that prevention, health prevention is key for all the reasons we have heard, and also because it will have the potential to decrease the public spending in health. So really a strong message to both basically institutions, but also citizens, that is important to focus on prevention. And there we actually see that there is still a lot to be done, at least in the European countries. Really, it requires quite a strong shift in the mentality to move towards prevention. And then when we look more at the institutional side, integration of healthcare, one of our most frequent recommendations is a rebalancing from the hospitalization to primary care. It's really important that the primary care level acts as a gatekeeper to diagnosis in early stage any morbosity status. So this also has the potential to help, at least from a public finance. As I was saying before, address staff shortages. I don't know if this will be covered in any of the successive presentation, but we believe that this is something that actually is really important to address, because we see that in many European countries, in the medical sector, in the healthcare sector, there are quite huge staff shortages. And there, basically, there is a clear negative impact, of course, because this creates long waiting time, it delays the moment of the diagnosis. So basically, in the medium term, it increases possibly the cost because people are diagnosed and enter in the healthcare system at a later stage than if we would have more GP. At the same time, solutions like incentivize the medical profession through higher salary would not be a solution, at least from a public finance perspective. So here, actually, I leave you with the question and without a solution. And also, it is based on our knowledge, also very unclear how much AI can really help when it comes to the medical profession. And then, of course, as I say, the digital solution and integrating the impact on health status on all our policies. Very briefly, I'm approaching the end of my time. When it comes to long-term care spending, again, baseline projections, the cost will be increasing between now and 2017. Here, when it comes to long-term care, one aspect that needs to really to be considered is that there is also an interesting socio-economic effect, because with the higher, which I mean is a very positive development, with the higher participation of women in the labor market and with the higher labor mobility, the fact that still many European countries rely a lot on family-based informal long-term care is going necessarily to change. And similarly to the health care, also for the long-term care, it will make a difference if the additional years in terms of life expectancy will be spent in a condition of disability or without disability. So again, is the same message as for the health care. And second message is that, as I said, at least in the European countries, currently the situation is very heterogeneous. We have only a few countries with universal system. Many countries have basically minimalistic services when it comes to long-term care, and still many countries have just informal system. Now, if we consider a policy scenario where all the countries would converge to a EU average in terms of probability to receive a long-term care assistance, and so in terms of both coverage and costs, which again are very positive developments that we aim at. In terms of costs and impact on public finances, this is going to be huge. It's going to be almost 3 times higher than it is now. So in terms of redesigning, in terms of reforms, one thing that we believe is really important is to establish a clear system to assign every care recipient to the appropriate level of care provider. Not everyone has to go to an institution. There can be home care, although it in a formalized way, it can be cash benefit. So it's important to establish an appropriate correspondence between care setting and care recipient. We see a lot of fragmentation in the way European countries provide long-term care. This has also to be addressed, and perhaps mostly, let's say, from analytical perspective, one thing that we are struggling a lot is that when it comes to long-term care, basically the data are of very low quality, very heterogeneous. So basically, I mean, there is also a lot of work in terms of data availability. So a few conclusions. Indeed, public expenditure on pension, health, and long-term care will put pressure on public finances. This needs to be addressed because will be not the only needs to be addressed. We have the green transition, we have defense, so there will be a lot of competing needs to be addressed. And this is why reforms are important. I didn't have the time to enter into it, but I believe that also the intergenerational fairness is something that we need to consider. And perhaps just as a few words, when it comes to reforms, beside the pension reforms that are a story of themselves, with the Next Generation EU and the Recovery Resilience Facility that were triggered with the biggest health crisis that we have been having over the past years, we have actually the potential to boost reforms in the member states. Currently, when just focusing on healthcare and long-term care under the Next Generation EU in the European countries, there are 120 reforms in the healthcare and the long-term care system that are being enacted. So this is a success story and something to be happy about. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Angela. Perhaps we should take some questions if there is someone from the audience. Professor Tinios. And please give us your name.
It's an observation or perhaps a clarification. What you mentioned are the public costs for longevity. That means in a very large number of countries, these come up after a significant retrenchment of public expenditure, for example, pensions I mean, especially in Greece, that comes after some rather radical reforms. Now, this seems to me creates a gap for the private sector. I mean, it's essentially, it's a call for the private sector to step up. And my question is, are there any levers to work out or to track whether the private and occupational sector is actually responding, or is it really just wishful thinking?
Okay, I start replying to this one. Yes, no, you are totally right that there is a potential for the private sector. Actually, I did not have the time, but basically it's something that we also recommend a rebalancing between what we call the first pillar, the second and the third pillar of the pension system. If there is a potential there, definitely yes. We have already some cases where basically auto-enrollment under the second, third pillar, under private system are becoming sort of indeed automatic or mandatory coverage for these different pillars. So there are a number of avenues that can be indeed exploited. And then of course there are all the other questions that were somehow addressed, I mean, at least asked already yesterday. I mean, all these saving and contribution that will go through private funds. Of course, there is also a question where to channel. I mean, of course, there is an important role when it comes to the income replacement function, so in terms of the pension system itself, but one of the questions that we are asking ourselves in Brussels is all this money and saving, I mean, how could also contribute to boost the growth and the investment capacity of Europe. But yeah, you're very right.
Okay. Now, Professor Tsakloglu, the former Deputy Minister for our pension scheme. You are responsible for the reform, okay, sorry.
Okay, thank
apologize.
Thank you for your kind words. First of all, thank you very much for the very nice presentation. In the pensions part, you were arguing, and actually there are several voices in favor of this idea of focusing more on career length rather than time of retirement. This can be explosive. If we are otherwise identical, but we both work for 40 years, for instance, I started 20, you started 30, this means that if we respect this rule, I will have 10 more years of pensions. If we do not take any measure there, the cost will be enormous, the additional cost. Do you argue for equal pensions for equal number of years of employment and contributions, or this proposal contains also some kind of the adjustment of the level of the pension?
No, thanks for the question and also for giving me the opportunity to clarify. So basically, everything that I was talking about and showing is a sort of a basket. As I said, we don't have the silver bullet. It's just that basically are the different dimensions of our thinking. And we believe that actually, as I said, a link to life expectancy is crucial, is probably the basic principle, but at the same time, it is a fact that basically the job market, the labor market is changing, that people are more educated, have the potential, I mean, they will enter probably, as I said, later have the potential to stay more, and probably they are happy to stay more. So it's just a dimension to be thought about. I'm not in any way saying that this is the 100% solution or way to go.
Thanks. So very interesting presentation. So one thing that I think is containing the rise in the pension and the GDP ratios in a lot of these projections is assumptions on productivity growth, because a lot of the pensions are indexed to prices, not wages. And so are you concerned about the future of productivity growth when you do these projections? And I know there's some robustness, you know, and typically it's done relative to productivity assumptions, but are you concerned about that? And also, are there ways to de-link by doing reforms to remove the dependency on productivity growth?
No, in fact, the baseline projections are done under the assumptions that there are no productivity gains. So basically, in our model, we have our TFP projections, but without basically factoring in any impact from innovation, developments. So this would actually be a sort of different scenario, and clearly, I mean, with some positive looping effect, but it's not what is reflected in our policy, no policy change projections. Is without any assumptions in terms of productivity gains. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Scott. And
thank you. Another great outline. I guess I've got a couple of things. One will perhaps link into the next panel. You're looking here at how we stabilize the public finances, which of course is incredibly important. But I think from that 2 points I thought, one was, it was striking to see how many countries are linking the retirement age to life expectancy. And I think that's wrong for all sorts of reasons. And I think it should be healthy life expectancy. And I think that's going to be a really big political challenge if we just keep raising the retirement age linked to life expectancy, let alone all the distributional issues. The other thing which I think just, I do the same thing myself, you showed the increase in health costs that will come from aging. And so if we can age better, we can spend less. I do sort of think governments are going to have to start thinking, if we spend more, we can get people healthy. And that in itself is going to be incredibly important. So I think there's going to be a real tension there in how we think about the health systems. I think to some degree, treasuries think that spending money on disease and care is a dead weight loss. Whereas I think if you can keep people, if you can compress morbidity, it's an incredible welfare gain. And I don't know how that issue gets raised up the ministries of finance, because making us healthy is incredibly important. It's the most important aspect of an aging society. So it's more of a comment than a question. But,
okay. Accelerate a bit.
Even though this approach that you mentioned before about healthy living is absolutely, from a theoretical perspective, is correct, in practical terms it is impossible to do. Life expectancy is something that we measure. Healthy life expectancy is something that depends on the model that you use. There is an equivalent in macroeconomics. In macroeconomics in the European Union, we have this rule of 3%, etc., etc., and also for the deficits and so on. We all know that the correct measure is the to look at the cyclically adjusted structural deficit. However, this is something that is model-based. This is not something that you observe in the national accounts. Therefore, it is extremely difficult. Even though theoretically it is very appealing, in practice it is extremely difficult to implement.
Very live discussion, but okay, 2 more questions and we stop it because we run out of time. Felice, and then...
Yeah, my question was very related to what Andrew just mentioned. It was also more about a communication strategy for what we are trying to achieve. Because, when you do the pension reform, it's always linked to fiscal tightening, consolidation, that type of discussion, and therefore it brings a bit of a negative stigma to the public discussion on that as well. And as Andrew mentioned, maybe that we need to spend first, increase the public spending for longevity, for prevention, and then start thinking about increasing the retirement age or broader pension reforms. So, is there a thinking in terms of maybe this should be presented as more of a medium-term package on aging and longevity that certain policies could be sequenced depending on country-specific circumstances, but in certain cases you may need to increase spending first. Yeah.
Thank you, Felix, for the question. And actually, this is one of the reasons, I could not develop more why I wanted to, finish my concluding remarks with the very positive experience of the Next Generation EU and the Recovery and the Resilience Facility, because this is indeed, as I said, we have 120 reforms on the health system and the long-term care system being enacted. And in terms also of communication, one of the messages we passed, which was a shift from the usual way money from Brussels are seen, the message that we passed with the Next Generation EU is, yes, you will have money, yes, it will be important to build a new hospital, but before building a new hospital, it's even more important that you reform the way healthcare systems are provided to citizens. So there is actually, this mentality is something that has taken shape over the past years, and we are doing a huge communication effort. As I said, pension system is more really on the realm of the traditional public finances. It's something that actually we are discussing with the countries, not really under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, with some, yes, but not all of them, but mostly with under the new governance system with the medium-term fiscal structural plans. Of course, is something that we are saying, okay, in case you do a pension reform, you could have a more gradual adjustment in terms of consolidation. You can move from the 4 years to the 7 years. So it's something that, we are also passing the message to the countries.
Okay, and the last one, please, because we are out of time. Please.
I just wanted to ask you if you or anybody at your directorate is dealing with insurance companies related to long-term care. Because insurance companies are rather discriminatory of age. In other words, they don't want to work with people over 65 or 70, and they are not very happy. As Professor Scott mentions in his book, there are tools that insurance companies can find to deal with issues of covering long-term care. Do you have any answer on that? Hello?
To be totally honest, is not something that the department where I'm coming from follows in terms of insurance schemes, but there are other parts in the European Commission that look at the insurance system as well, but I would not be able to give a proper and direct answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Angela. And sorry for we ran out of time and we have over yours our program here. Thank you very much. I would like to invite now to the podium for your keynote speech Mrs. Shruti Singh, Senior Economist at the OECD. Shruti specializes in aging and employment policies, focusing on promoting age-inclusive workplaces, supporting older workers and addressing labor market challenges related to demographic change. The keynote speech title, Redesigning Institutions for Longevity Society, the Role of Work, Firms, and Long Life Learning. Please.
Thank you, Aris. Good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here and be part of this excellent collaborative between the CEPR, OECD Crete Centre, and the Greek government. Yesterday, we spent much time discussing about remarkable rise in longevity, and I think what became clear to all of us is that while there are some cost, or it's often seen as a demographic challenge, in fact, people living longer can bring lots of benefits to our economy and societies. I think what also became clear is that these benefits are not going to be coming about automatically. We're going to have to change and radically rethink about our institutions that shape how we work, learn, and age. And this is not a novel thought that I've had overnight. The OECD has been advocating for these reforms, institutional reforms, over the last 30 decades, at least the earliest publication that I could find online, I'm sure there are some that didn't make it online, goes back to 1998 in a report on maintaining prosperity for an aging society, in which we said, meeting the challenge of aging populations will require comprehensive reform that address the fiscal, financial, and labor market implications of aging, as well as the implications for pensions, social benefits, systems of health, and long-term care. So this goes back around 30 years already. We then go on, sort of 10 years, well, another couple of years, in which we say individuals should be as free as possible to decide when they retire, so on and so forth. And fast forward, in a publication called Live Longer, Work Longer, we say in the face of population aging, a new agenda for reform is urgently required to improve the job prospects for older workers. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is spend a little bit of time in discussing, well, how well have we done? Have we actually made changes, and to what extent, and where remain some of the bottlenecks to really achieve some of the discussions and aspirations that we've been talking in the last two days? I want to start with this chart that I call the longevity versus work paradox. And what you see here is two different lines. In the top, you see the life expectancy at effective age of labor market exit. And at the bottom of the chart, you see the effective age of labor market exit itself. And what you see is that in the beginning of or at the end of the 20th century, early retirement just simply exploded. We started to do a little bit better, and labor force participation went up in the 21st century, but so did life expectancy. And so taken all together, at least all of the countries in the OECD, we've still failed to actually bring people back into the labor market and give them, or change the policies and reforms to set back to the levels we had seen in the 70s. And so I think the main message of this chart is that even though the policies have been changing, life expectancy is moving so fast, or has been moving so fast, that reforms and policies are still lagging behind. And so we're always still catching up with the speed in which the life expectancy has been increasing. And the paradox continues, and we discussed a lot about this yesterday, that labor force participation and bringing older people into the labor market is going to be one of the key aspects or tools to offset some of the negative effects of rapid population aging. But despite some of the success stories, of course, where in particularly what you see in this chart is that older women in particular have done very well in the labor market. Majority of the gains in terms of employment have come from older workers across the OECD, but we still see a huge decline at the age of 50, and this decline gets steeper as we get older, and when it comes to getting labor market opportunities for older individuals, even though we're living healthier and for longer. And this really just shows the disconnect, I would say, between how much work norms and employment practices are lagging behind the demographic reality. And it's not just participation in the labor market, I would say. A lot of it is about progression. And what you see here is simple data showing you the job-to-job and occupational mobility rates over the life cycle. And what we see is that basically job-to-job mobility or career progression simply just flattens out as we get older. Now, why is this bad? Well, it's bad because as we age, we might just want to rethink on what the jobs that we want, the occupations that we work in. And as we evolve, our health changes and our expectations towards work changes. And so we need to have the options to actually switch jobs even as we age. And the current system just doesn't allow you to do that. It's also about the changes in the labor market, the fact that AI and the transition to the green economy is going to be rendering some skills obsolete, and some jobs will simply not exist. And so we need to make sure that actually career progression or career mobility, which is much discussed when we're young, also needs to be part of discussions in mid-career and at older ages. And it's not just structural issues. Sadly, the societal and cultural attitudes towards working longer and being active still remain very negative and present. Here, what you see is the share of workers aged 45 and over who experience age discrimination in the workplace. And I think we can present this chart and data in very many different ways, and there's lots of survey data showing the fact that older workers, many of them report some sort of experience towards age discrimination, whether that's in terms of promotions or in training or in terms of hiring. This tends to be, these perceptions towards age discrimination tend to be very high. And I think what's very interesting is that when you look at this data, even going back 30, 40 years, it's one factor in the labor market that is always there. It has just simply not budged. The way society and employers think about the ability and the capacity of older workers. And not only that policy and reforms are not reflecting to the realities of 80-plus life expectancy, it also comes at a very expensive cost. And I think we discussed this yesterday, the fact that there's going to be a huge shrinking of the working age population in many of the OECD countries. And in some countries, we expect labor force to be declining as much as 30 to 40% in countries like Korea and Lithuania and Poland. And this is going to have clear negative impacts on our GDP as we reduce the labor input into the equation. And it's not just that, and I think Matthias made a reference to this yesterday, the fact that it has a cost to businesses, the fact that older workers and younger workers, when combined together, working together, there's a lot of evidence showing that actually the complementarities of these two different cohorts can in fact boost productivity at the firm level. So what needs to change, and what sort of institution and reforms we still need to make progress on this front? I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about lots of different policy pillars, which I think in their own right deserve a session in itself. And Lisa, I know, is going to be talking quite a bit around rethinking work and later retirement, so I'm going to move these through quite swiftly. Well, what is rethinking work and later all about? Well, I spoke about individuals' perceptions and age discrimination. Very sadly, it's also about institutional ageism, which is still very present from the 70s. The system, when we talk about employment regulations, such as employment protection legislation, or the way the social welfare system is designed, unemployment insurance, or some employer practices, such as seniority wages, which pretty much goes back to the 1970s, when the agenda was to push out older workers to make room for younger individuals, still remain in many countries, despite the evidence that age-specific hiring and firing rules can actually be costly and dampen their hiring effects. Unemployment insurance in 15 out of the 34 OECD countries, data shows that actually generosity of unemployment insurance increases exponentially by age. And while that can be beneficial and prevent people falling into poverty, and people need the means and the support to get back into the labor market, it also creates and reduces job search incentives. Similarly, seniority wages, I would say they have been declining quite a lot in many countries, but if we look at countries like Japan, Korea, but also Belgium and Germany, where you have very strong collective bargaining agreements, seniority wages still remain the norm, can also hinder hiring of older workers. And it's not just about labor market regulations. Job design and workplace policies also need to evolve with the changing realities in the of longevity. I think there's a sort of a fair amount of discussion we've had yesterday, but there's a consensus that actually older workers, like younger workers, would benefit from increasing workplace flexibility. It helps them to reconcile their health needs with working needs, but also combining childcare with caregiving and other caregiving responsibilities. But according to a survey that we ran with ARP 2 years ago, shows that actually older workers or mature workers aged 55 to 64 seem to have very few access to flexible work compared to their younger workers. And it's not just about flexibility in midlife, and we've had much discussion around pensions just in the earlier session, but also yesterday. It's also about giving opportunities for flexibility in terms of how do we actually retire if there is such a term as retirement, in the way if we think about devising longevity, it's about can we offer individuals the opportunity to gradually maintain their labor market attachment, but also support them to do other activities in their life. And this is an area where pension policy, we've spoken a lot about retirement ages, but I think where the bottleneck still remains is, in fact, how can we combine pensions with labor income, which remains actually quite a limited area, limited for many workers. So here you see the share of people aged 50 to 69 who continue to work at the beginning of their pension receipt. And what you see is that actually very few people take up these opportunities when they arise. And it's not just about the pension system, it's about improving financial literacy. Many people are still myopic and just don't know how much wealth they would have or how much income they would have once they retire. And many just don't plan in terms of how much they would need. And so I think this isn't just showing sort of the regulatory challenges and policies that we need to change, but it's also showing the missing link, which is about education and educating individuals, which I think the pension system hasn't really done so well in many OECD countries. So very quickly, I've said some of this before. I think what I want to focus on is not what can be done, but mostly actually bring your attention to a little bit of good practice that we've been collecting at the OECD, and this is our advantage to sort of facilitate and what we can learn from other countries. When we talk about flexibility, and as we know, with population, with rising longevity, many people would actually need caregiving needs, and so in Lithuania, employers, there's a legislation where employers must grant unpaid leave to employees caring for a sick family for a duration up to 30 days. In the UK, in my home country, an initiative that I would say was born in the private sector, namely in the financial insurance sectors, to help their workers in midlife plan for their retirement, led to a national-wide initiative called the MOT, which pretty much stands for Ministry of Transport. The idea was the way we actually do an annual check of a car, we should also be doing an annual check of ourselves and our skills and our career aspirations. And so this midlife career review actually supports workers aged 45 and over in terms of their career planning, skills needs, and health and wealth. So it's quite a comprehensive tool in helping workers in their midlife. Another area that needs substantial rethinking is about corporate and business policies. It's an area that's pretty much overlooked, funnily enough, when we spend most of our time at work. And in fact, a lot of the policies at the employer level is something little that the governments can do. This is when we're talking about employers' attitudes and changing and encouraging them to think about the investments they need to be making in their aging, or let's say, aging or workforces. What is this about? I think a lot of this is about job quality, age-friendly jobs. Andrew, you've written quite a lot about that, and I think I just want to shed a light from a different perspective here. What this is showing you in this chart is the reasons why people switched jobs and the reasons why people retired early. And what we find is that the top 3 reasons for all workers, regardless of age, were the fact that they were paid low, so it's low pay. It's about feeling undervalued. It's also about lack of advancement in their jobs. Now, when we talk about, let's say, mid-career or older workers, the reasons are slightly different. So all these things do matter for older people, but what also matters is the fact that it's about experiencing health problems, caregiving, and poor working conditions. That could be physical work or other working conditions that are unsafe and unsanitary to be working in. And so this really shows you the array of different policy mix and the different types of job quality or job quality dimensions that one needs to be thinking about when we talk about retaining older workers in their jobs. And I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that actually it's easier to retain than getting older people back into the labor market, because that's one of the hardest things. And I haven't seen a single country where we've successfully managed to bring older unemployed or long-term unemployed back into the labor market. So improving job quality and ensuring that actually jobs are catered towards the needs of older workers is going to be one of the key aspects in this challenge. It's also about integrating health and well-being at the workplace. This has come up again yesterday in terms of prevention and the role of health systems. We need to have healthy diets, exercise programs. All of that is necessary. It's critical. But I think we also need to be thinking a little bit wider. What is the role of workplaces and actually using the workplace as an intervention for prevention, but also supporting workers who already have chronic illnesses? And what you see in this chart is actually that the share of employed persons with chronic morbidity, which of course rises by age, but I would say that actually many of the mid-career and even younger workers actually have chronic illnesses. So it's not necessarily about just designing and having policy when you're older. If we can think through the life cycle, it can actually benefit lots of different age groups in the labor market and in the labor force. I spoke a little bit about this earlier, so I'm going to skip this slide. And this is just to sum up this section. We've run a survey 5 years ago among employers, asking them what share of employers actually have any of the policies that we think proven and would make sense in the context of an aging workforce. So things like mentoring or reverse mentoring programs, which can actually help overcome bias, but also facilitate cross-learning between different age groups, unbiased recruiting processes, re-entry, return-to-work programs. I mean, regardless of any of the programs that, that would make sense in the context of actually where older and younger people would come together, only 7% of the employers said that they have any of these programs. And so it's an area where I would say there's much room for public policy to actually support workers. Of course, some large employers have these policies in place, but a lot of SMEs do not have the capacity or the resources to actually implement these programs. And so there's much scope, both from the employer side, but also from the public policy side to support businesses to think about longevity at the workplace. Again, some couple of interesting initiatives around investments in well-being that come from Japan, and we know Japan is one of the front runners when it comes to thinking about and responding successfully to longevity, where large corporations complete a health and productivity survey and get tailored feedback for improvement. And I know some of these things seem quite light, and I think the idea really is to get businesses to start thinking about the changes that need to be making at the workplace. The Austrian government very recently has started to provide free counseling advice through their public employment services to create age-appropriate workplaces. Many employers just don't know what it means about designing working time policies or the kind of support that workers might need if they have a disability there. And so we do slowly start to see some changes in terms of public policy, but these are really far and few, and there's much scope to be done on this area. The last policy pillar, and I think this one is something that we're all aware of, is about the importance of education as a lifelong process. As we age, I think it's not just about getting resilient to the changes in the labor market, the fact that we'll need new skills as new jobs are created and giving people opportunities to benefit from, let's say, the AI and the green transition. It's also about giving them greater confidence. In a survey that we ran with a US NGO that provides training for mid-career and older workers, we found that actually many older workers lose their confidence inability to find their work as they age. And so good education is also about boosting and reboosting confidence levels as we age. I mean, I think as we age, one thing that's happened in the last 40, 50 years is that we're all very familiar with having a lifetime employment system. I mean, if we were suddenly finding ourselves at the age of 50 or 55 to re-switching or reskilling and finding a new job, we just don't know how to and where to get started. And so I think a lot of it is about boosting confidence of older workers, and this is where the education system can play a huge role. I spoke quite a bit about sort of career progression, and again, what is fascinating about the education system is that it's still very much geared towards the younger individuals, rightly so, but really has failed, and it's very myopic in terms of the longevity gains we've seen over the life cycle. So when we ask individual older workers compared to the younger workers, far few of them would say that they actually regularly review options for job or career changes. So even though a lot of governments have been putting in place career guidance systems, most of them are actually targeted towards towards younger individuals rather than mid-career and older workers. And according to the latest survey of adult skills across the OECD, which was just launched last year, there's a bit of a good news that sort of, participation in skills and training by age across all age groups have gone up. But in every single OECD country, older workers tend to participate far less compared to their younger counterparts. And I think despite the rhetoric and the huge public debate and investment in public policy in terms of improving and bringing older people closer to labor markets and lifelong learning, it's something that we need to be working on continuously and for a long time. And I think these sort of disparities in participation in training are showing pretty much two things. It's not just, again, the lack of availability of training. It's also actually individuals themselves. Many older individuals feel training is not worthwhile as soon as you reach the age of 55 or even 60 because of the perception of leaving the labor market early on. And so in some countries, we see quite a few initiatives about giving paid training leave. For instance, in Belgium, for many older workers, if we have a full-time job, it's actually difficult to train in something else, and we also have a family. And so, again, far and few, but actually in the private sector, employers are giving older workers paid training leave where they can actually take time off from work while getting paid to actually participate and upskill and reskill. In Singapore, similarly, the government is offering the mid-career enhanced subsidy to encourage mid-career workers to reskill and upskill, covering 90% of their training cost when they attend vocational and university institutions. So in this, like I said, I think all of these different dimensions merit and are big topics in their own right. And so this was a little bit of a snapshot in terms of where institutions need to be changing and where we lag behind and where there are some pockets of good practices coming about. And so conclude, I would just say that I think employers must rethink inclusion. It's not just that we're aging, workplaces are also aging, and a lot of the policies don't need to be necessarily thought about older workers versus younger individuals. What we find is that when it comes to attitudes towards work and what people want from work, the attitudes of younger and older workers are pretty much the same. Everybody wants a job that pays well, that gives you flexibility, and where you're valued. It's also about creating more flexibility, flexibility in terms of our jobs, but also how we want to retire and when we want to retire. And lifelong learning as a core infrastructure. This is the backbone, I would say, and it's something that not just enables you to participate in the labor market or helps you stay engaged, it's going to help you stay engaged in social activity, but also political and other dimension. And as we know, a lot of research showing that upskilling, reskilling, learning new things can actually also enhance cognitive behavior. And last but not least, I think we need to be involving all stakeholders, including social partners and businesses. I was in Belgium just last week, where we just heard from the social partners that actually they've developed something called the Demography Fund, which is a scheme to really, a sectorial specific scheme to help older workers switch from one sector to another sector. So there's a lot of innovation, a lot of good practices happening between social partners that are just being missed out from us, that we ought to be following and tapping into in terms of learning good practices. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tuti. I suggest, since we are running behind schedule, to move on and to keep the Q&A for our panel discussion, since you will be with us at that time. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite David Canning, Professor of Economics and International Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, for the presentation of his paper, Policy Responses to Rising Longevity, a Welfare-Based Approach. David's research has focused on the role of improvements in health and demographic changes on economic growth, working at the intersection of demography, epidemiology, and economics. Please.
I'm David Canning from Harvard, and I used to be an economist. So many years ago, I was an economist, but for the last 20 years or so, I've been working on issues around demography and health, partly because I think they're really important for the economy. And I thought they were enormous drivers of economic growth in low-income settings, and getting at issues of fertility, longevity, and health were really important. And so what I'm going to say is, I think a little bit different, because I'm coming at this really from someone who's been outside the economics field for a while. It's very exciting for me to see what economists are doing again. But I think my perspective is somewhat different from a lot of what I'm seeing here. The first point I want to make is that longer, healthy lifespans are an enormous gain to human welfare. I think that's an obvious point. I think Andrew Scott has made this point. Living longer is basically increasing our opportunity set. The fundamental constraint that we face is what is our lifetime and what we can do with that lifetime. The reason that we see it as a problem is that it is inconsistent with our institutions. Our institutions are set up for a different demography. The modern populations and historical institutions that we have are incompatible. And I'm going to propose something which I haven't heard very much, is that institutions should change to serve the population. What I've heard quite a lot in the last 2 days is how people can change to sustain our existing institutions. One thing that keeps coming up, it came up this morning, also came up yesterday, is that people should work longer, and it's partly to keep our social security systems sustainable. But sustaining social security system is not the purpose of human civilization. The purpose of the social security system is to improve human welfare. And what I haven't seen in the last 2 days is very much welfare economics, and saying what is good for human welfare and how can our institutions serve that. So I'm a little bit worried that we're getting the problem the wrong way around. And I think by focusing more on welfare, we'll not only get better policies, but also get more socially acceptable policies. There was a very good question from the floor yesterday about the issue of we want to do these social security reforms, but actually a lot of people don't want to work longer. They actually come out and demonstrate in the streets when you try to make them work longer. And that should be a little bit of a clue that working longer is not always welfare improving. If we're asking people to pay a cost, we have to be pretty sure that the benefits they're getting are larger than those costs. And that's not as clear to me as it seems to be to some people here who I think assuming that working longer is an obvious outcome. Another point I would make is we talk a lot about old age dependency, and I think it's really important that old age dependency is a biological, social, and institutional construct. The issue of whether old people are dependent is partly a biological question. Are they healthy enough to take care of themselves? But it's also a social and institutional question. We make them dependent if we have transfer systems. If old people have Social Security transfers, they are dependent. But if they save for their own retirement, or if the Social Security system is fully funded, they're not dependent. They have their own resources to take care of themselves. So dependency is a construct. It's not an absolute constraint. We make them dependent by setting up institutions that base their income on transfers. A final point I want to make and emphasize is that income per capita is not a welfare measure. I knew Richard Stone, who invented the national accounts and GDP. I think looking at GDP per capita is very interesting as a positive economics question. But I think it's a bit lazy to assume that higher GDP is a good thing and lower GDP per capita is a bad thing. If we have to work harder to get that extra GDP, we have to balance the extra income against the costs of getting it. And that's a welfare question. And I think it's a little bit lazy to assume that GDP per capita is a goal. I think people are not, they know that's not true, but there's an underlying assumption in some of the talks I heard that lower GDP per capita is a problem. I think it's not a problem if you're getting welfare benefits in other ways. I would say the Canning household has lower GDP per capita because we had 2 children. I'd probably halved my household income per capita, but I was much happier. I think China got enormous increases in income per capita through its one-child policy. But forcing people to have fewer children than they want to increase GDP per capita can be very welfare reducing. The forced abortion policy made people very, very unhappy. And so I worry a little bit about some of the discussion, not so much here, but in other settings, around changing fertility in order to sustain our institutions. That's really putting the institutions as the goal and people as the mechanism. And we should be putting people first, and institutions should be designed to serve people. I just want to highlight this paper. It's not a bad paper. I think it's a good paper, but it's Sustainable Social Security 4 options. And it says we need to work longer, we need to increase contribution rates. And this is the sort of paper we see in a lot of economic settings, is that the sustaining the system is assumed to be the goal, and the policy options are the things we can do to achieve that. I think an historical context here is very interesting, and so I'm going to take a long-run view. And actually, this is not the worst demographic crisis to face Europe. We have had a huge conflict between demographics and institutions before, and I think it's very interesting to look back at how we dealt with that. The last enormous demographic crisis in Europe was the Black Plague. The Black Plague killed 30 to 50% of the population. That's an enormous demographic change. The institution we had at that time was the feudal system, and that was incompatible with the post-plague demography. There was a shortage of workers. The feudal system was based on a labor surplus economy. There was a shortage of land. If a serf ran away, the lord next door would catch him and bring him back. He didn't want to serf. He had serfs of his own. In labor shortage economy, those serfs could run away and get higher paid employment with other feudal lords and in cities. And so there were meetings, probably like this one. I don't think the CEPR was in existence then, but if they were, they would have had a meeting saying, how can we sustain the feudal system in the face of this huge demographic shock? And actually there were policy recommendations. And one of them you'll be very familiar with is that people should work to age 68. Is that there was a shortage of labor, so people should work more. And so everyone under age 68 would be compelled to work. This is in the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, the Statute of Labourers in 1351. They were bound to serve where they were working in 1347, so people were moving to get better jobs because of the labor shortage, but that was really undermining the feudal system, so they had to go back. Also, people were getting higher wages, which the lords didn't like, and so wages were set to those paid in 1347, and actually the Act has a list of all the wages for each occupation. So carpenters would get 2 pence a day, master carpenters 3 pence a day, but every occupation was listed with a wage rate. Fortunately, this attempt to sustain the feudal institution failed. And what we got out of it was wage labor, capitalism, and labor mobility. And I think that was a good thing. And so I think we should accept that sometimes institutions should fail when they're no longer serving the population. I think welfare went up through the collapse of the feudal system and the move to capitalism. So we shouldn't always assume that institutions should be sustained. And when they're not serving the population, they should fail, and we should replace them with better institutions. The 20th century was actually an era of enormous institutional innovation. The pension system was an innovation. The national health system was an innovation. And I think we should be thinking hard about what new institutions we'll be setting up, what institutions we should be abolishing, instead of making sustainability of existing institutions the goal. Otherwise, we fall the risk of going into this trap of trying to sustain things which are actually hurting our welfare. It's possible to do this. I highlight this paper, which I think is going along a much better line. It's retirement financing, an optimal reform approach. And it's asking the question, what is a Pareto optimal reform? How can we reform the pension system so that everyone is better off? So I like it that it has a welfare goal rather than a sustainability goal. I also like that it thinks about new policy instruments. And so one of the policy instruments it thinks of is having a tax on assets and a tax and subsidies on assets. So actually one of the optimal policies is that people should save for retirement, but there should be a tax rate and sort of low rates of returns for the wealthy and subsidies to people with low wealth. And what I see in terms of our policy options today is there was sort of quite a narrow range. Is that we were on the retirement age, contribution rates, and we should be thinking a little bit more on the extensive margin about new policy approaches. I don't agree with the details of the paper. I'm emphasizing it as a general approach. I like the model. It has overlapping generations, heterogeneous agents, but it has no biology or health. And I think one of the big issues around optimal retirement is actually this biological and health constraint on people's capacity to work. It also doesn't have bounded rationality. I think a lot of the issue around our institutions is that we want to help people make the right decisions because they're not fully rational in their decision making. But I would highlight this approach as one that I like, and if people said to me the goal is welfare and how can we design systems to get better welfare, I would be much happier. I would say actually I was interested in a couple of the macro models presented yesterday. And one of the interesting things about those macro models, even though they focus on GDP and wealth and interest rates as outcomes, they are based on a utility function. But they didn't really spend a lot of time looking at what's in that utility function and what are the welfare effects of demographic change. But macro models do have welfare built into them because they're utility-based approaches. If we want to pursue this research agenda, there are two fundamental questions. The first question is, what is human welfare? And I'm telling you now, it's not GDP per capita. There's a lot more to life. And I think economics risks being sidelined and ignored if it thinks that welfare is GDP per capita. People care about a lot of other things. The other issue is, what are the real constraints on achieving this? I think we are very focused on income constraints, but actually this lifespan and healthy life constraint is really fundamental. The institutions should not be treated as constraints. The institutions are mechanisms for achieving high welfare with these real constraints. This graph shows the income per capita in the UK over the last 200 years. And we've had this industrial revolution with an enormous economic success. Income per capita is now 13 times higher than it was in 1800. So that's an enormous success story. And that is part of human welfare, but it's not the whole part, it's not all of human welfare. This is life expectancy at birth, going from just over 40 years to over 80 years over the same period. Again, an enormous improvement in human welfare. In the early period, it's reductions in child mortality. In the later period, it's extensions on longevity of older people. But this is a huge improvement in human welfare. There was quite a lot of discussion over the last 2 days on this issue of compression of morbidity. The idea that we're not only living longer, but it's longer healthy lives, and the period at the end of life where you have disability and illness is getting shorter. And that's really, really good news. There are emerging counterexamples in the United States and in the UK that what we're seeing is disability at earlier ages. There's been a plateauing or even a reduction in life expectancy, an earlier onset of disability, and that's really, really worrying. And so one of the reasons I moved into health is I think one of the big issues is how do we get better health? We need to get better health, and getting that is, we're not very good at it. I think we heard John Bell yesterday talk about this. I think there really needs to be a move from treatment to prevention, where the health gains are much bigger, and it's a move away from health systems to public health to some extent, if we really want to get health gains. We've seen these age-specific mortality rates going down, so that older people have more morbidity, but the new cohorts tend to have less morbidity. And this is particularly true of things like dementia, where dementia rates in older people, the age-specific incidence rates are going down. There is one really worrying trend that really concerns me in this area, which is cohort effects on disability among young people. So if we look at this graph, this separates, so this is an age period cohort model of European disability. And what you see is a long-term trend by cohorts to less disability. But after around 1970, the younger cohorts, we see them now with rising rates of disability. So the cohorts after age 70 are now people under 50, so they're not in the really ill, older age group. But what we're seeing is higher rates of health problems, particularly mental health problems, but also physically health problems in these young cohorts. And that's very worrying for future prospects on longevity and aging. So I think we don't fully understand why these young cohorts are doing so badly in terms of health. But it is a very, I think there's a pessimistic scenario here, more pessimistic than perhaps we were seeing based on looking at disability in older people. I'd really like to emphasize this graph, which I think a lot of what I've said so far has been common, but I think this is one of the huge improvements in human welfare. So if you go back to 1980, people were working more than 65 hours a week. And one of the things that's happened over the last 200 years is a move towards shorter working weeks. We're now down at around 35 hours a week. And what's happened is people get richer, they take more time as leisure because they enjoy not working, they enjoy their leisure as well as the income. And as welfare goes up, we tend to move to higher consumption, but also higher leisure. And this is what's missing from that GDP per capita focus. There's been an enormous welfare gain from the shorter working week. That trend went until 1990. So if you look at this, is the we've seen this before. This is the average age of exiting the labour market in the UK. It's now going up, and there was a sort of feeling in the room, I think, that this is a good thing. This helps pension systems. This increases GDP per capita. But actually, people don't like this. And this fact that we're reversing this long-term trend to more leisure is actually, I think, a very negative thing. Now, the issue is, it could be optimal. It could be with longer lives, longer healthy lives. We do want to move to longer periods of work. But I would be much happier if our income growth was enough that that effect dominated. It has up until 1970. The income effect dominated. We were so rich we could have more leisure. This is really saying we're getting poorer in welfare terms. In fact, we're getting so much poorer we have to work longer. So there's a really big question here about whether this is the optimal response. It's good for pension systems, but is it optimal for human welfare? And just what's happened is, what we see here is that the retirement age, eligibility age for Social Security was going down until the 70s. Now it's going up in order to make pension systems sustainable. And there's a big question, I think, about, we see this in all these OECD countries, whether this rise in work in older people is welfare enhancing or not. And so I think a focus on welfare would be a much better way of thinking about this issue. So we have to rethink welfare, focus on welfare, but we also think about what are the constraints. And as I've said, the really big issue, I think, is whether the old are dependents. Again, looking at old age dependency as people over 65 is a lazy thing to do. The question of whether people are dependent or not is an empirical question. It's whether they can take care of themselves biologically, but it's also whether they have the assets to look after themselves by paying someone to take care of them and have their consumption needs. Or are they dependent? Do they need someone to look after them? Or do they need transfers? The question is, do mental and physical disabilities make them dependent? Can they keep working? And this depends on both the biology and the institutions. In economics, we tend to have a lifespan effect, but there's actually very little measurement of health in macro models or even other models. I think this is something that Andrew Scott is pushing, but I really think we need to include health as a fundamental constraint. It's also a welfare goal in its own right. The prevalence of dementia goes up by age, but actually the health area tends to focus on ill health and sickness. I think we need to focus on healthy aging and abilities to work and perform at a high level. So I think there is an issue that what we mean by health in terms of welfare and in terms of constraints on productivity is different from what the health system focuses on. If you have dementia, you're in a very bad state. People are retiring and giving up work well before they enter dementia. This is some work I did looking at chess performance. Chess is very nice because it's a very intense cognitive test, and it's played across the age range. So we have people from age 5 all the way to age 100. Now what you see here is, this is the individual aging effect of age on chess performance, and the peak is around age 55, and as we saw yesterday in some productivity numbers, the decline with age is actually pretty small. So this looks like good news for how people age cognitively. Unfortunately, there's a lot of selection going on here. People playing competitive chess at old ages are very carefully selected. A bit like presenters at this conference. We're not random old people, we're carefully selected older people. If you control for a selection, people really like titles, and so people on the edge of a title tend to play more. The peak is maybe around 38, and there's actually a faster decline in cognitive ability. There's also a biological effect which is really important, is that young people learn more quickly. So the improvement in chess with experience, with games played, is much faster for the young, for people less than 20. And then at older ages, the gains of experience are lower. And I think these are not sort of Mincer equation types effect of optimal learning. This is biological. The brain is more plastic at younger ages. It's actually designed to absorb information quicker at younger ages and be less plastic at older ages. So I think we need better ways of measuring welfare, not just GDP. There are policies that can reduce GDP per capita but increase welfare. I think a really important point is that we have declining marginal utility of income, and money is not a good welfare measure. I'm getting short of time, so I'm going to skip through some points. This is some data on the value of life. People really like living. Andrew Scott said this yesterday. People are willing to pay a lot for life. So they really like living. It has a lot of money value. What I disagree a little bit with what he did is turning that into money values. I don't think money is a very good metric. Another way of looking at this is people's willingness to give up life for money goes down with income. And I think this reflects the declining marginal utility of income. And if you do that, you get a utility of money in life year equivalents, which shows this property. And it's very similar to what you get from risk aversion, is that we like money, we like to get richer, but it's got very diminishing returns. If you apply that to income per capita, that 13 times gain in income per capita is really only a 2.5 times gain from 1800 if we apply the fact that money has diminishing marginal utility. And this is saying as we get richer, we should actually be focusing less on GDP per capita. I think it's very important in poor settings and low-income settings, but in rich countries, we should be focusing less on it and more on other forms of welfare. I think a better welfare measure would include health, the wage rate. I think we should be giving people a large choice set and freedom to choose. I think we should be talking much more about life and liberty, giving people large choice sets and letting them choose what to do within that. And that's very consistent with Sen's capabilities approach, that a purpose of economists is not to make people happy, but to give them a large choice set. And I would argue strongly for a move away from income per capita towards something like fully equality adjusted life years. And so the years lived in good health with high income would be, to me, a much better welfare measure. And one of the reasons I think it's a much better welfare measure is quite a technical one, but some of you here will have studied expected utility theory, as I did in my youth. And expected utility is not linear in money. Expected utility tends to decline, marginal utility money declines, but expected utility is linear in probabilities. And the life expectancy is the sum of the survival probabilities at each age. And so expected utility is naturally linear in a life expectancy measure. And so life expectancy is this nice property that it goes one for one with expected utility. And so a welfare approach is really about maximizing life expectancy, where each year is adjusted for the quality of that life. And so I think we have the capability of getting a better welfare measure, and then using that, we can design our institutions optimally to maximize human welfare. So my time has run out, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. We have time to discuss when we have our panel discussion. And let's have a very quick break, a coffee break, because we are running more than half an hour behind schedule. Okay? I think we can start it. I would like to welcome Lisa Berkman, Professor of Public Policy, Epidemiology, and Global Health and Population at the Harvard Chan School, Director of the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, to present her paper on redesigning work and careers. Lisa's work focuses extensively on the impact of social conditions and public policies to health, with much of her current work relating to aging societies, workplace and well-being policies and practices, as well as the socioeconomic determinants of population health. Please, Lisa.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. Feels very loud up here. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't ever know whether it's best or worst to go last. But I think in this case, it's been such a congruent set of speeches this morning that I really look forward to being the last to build on what everybody has said. There'll be some overlap. By this time, I think there always is. But hopefully, it also moves into a new direction. So I want to just take a minute, even though we've done, probably everybody has done this, to look at demographic profiles. I've really picked France because I do a lot of work there, and Greece because we are here. And I just want to show the same thing that everybody else has shown, except I want you to concentrate on one thing. So this is France in 1950. It looks like kind of what we think of as a demographic period. Pyramid, this is 1975. You can see the rectangularization, 2000, 2025, and 2050, the projections. I want you to pay attention to the fertility at the very, very bottom. It's about 2.6% for fertility in this group. And I don't want to talk about fertility a lot, but I do want you to think about why do we have low fertility? Do we have low fertility because we have aging societies? Is it something about work? Is it interconnected? So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind. And then, of course, we'll look at Greece. This is 1950, 75. You see much kind of the same pyramid changing into a rectangularization. You can see the low fertility there, low fertility in 2050. It's somewhat lower than France at 2.1, and often now it's below replacement in many countries. So that kind of sets the scene for thinking about aging societies, that it's both, and this is what others have said, it's both the fact that everybody is living, that many people are living longer, life expectancy has improved, but what sets this pyramid or rectangular in shape also has a lot to do with what's at the bottom at younger ages and low fertility, and that contributes very mightily to this. The other thing that's really important that people haven't focused on is that the rate at which we get to be an aging society is enormously variable. France, for instance, has had about 100 years to get to this place. Sweden has gotten a very long time, US. Then you see Japan has gotten this way in almost no time. And of course, all the Southeast Asian countries have had almost no time to adapt. And countries that have 100 years, France and Germany are really two of the prime examples. Sweden have a lot of time to think about what's happening, how are the institutions going to adapt to countries that face this in a 20 or 30-year period. It's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to figure out what the optimal situation is. The other thing I want to show you is that the blue line is basically all the OECD countries and life expectancy during that time for men and women. The United States is way off this curve. I do this to show you that I'm going to give you the solution. I think we are part of the problem. And part of the reason that I come here is to learn like what everybody else is doing better, that we can really learn to adapt, because the United States in terms of life expectancy is, now 47th ranked in, a list of 60 or 70 countries. And clearly there's a problem that's going on in America. It's what motivates my work around work, I want to say, during this time. The other reason is I'm an epidemiologist, not an economist. So I am very interested in health as the outcome. What produces healthy longevity? What produces good aging? My theory is that it actually has a lot to do with the economic and social and welfare institutions that societies have and the working ones. And so this dynamic that we see where health drives good economic outcomes is a double directional, bidirectional sort of outcome. Very important to remember that the same factors that you see as outcomes probably predict health as well. And as somebody who's been working on social determinants of health, I'm very interested in how these institutional factors actually play in to produce health. That we don't produce health, I don't think, we only produce health at the margin in terms of our health systems. Very good at cure, as we've been saying before, terrible at prevention, not designed really for prevention at all. However, if we think about prevention, it's some of these social and economic institutions that are the major drivers of prevention. And so we need to focus on this bidirectionality much, much more. So what I want you to think about now, and people have alluded to this all the way along, thinking about aging societies in addition to aging individuals. It's not about what makes you healthy, it's what makes aging societies healthy. What is going to make aging societies healthy? I want to say it's imagining an entirely new normal. I think David had set this up really well. What we need to do is leave behind the age-structured buckets that we realize are really no longer functional. And there are probably 3 of them. I'm mostly going to talk about rethinking work and retirement. But, when we design major institutions in most societies, we decide education happens early in life, although probably none of you finished your education when you were 22, maybe 35, or maybe there are 40-year-olds. But, you did education in the middle. Then you had this crazy period of working like crazy and having a family. And then you had this other period that is this very ill-defined retirement period, which now could span 30 years. Nobody ever thought of living 30 years in this other state. And for anybody who's in the middle now, you'll know that is so hard to keep up. And so the idea is, what if we just let it go? These buckets are no longer functional. The way we designed institutions when we had a pyramid and when you received retirement for a couple of years is one thing. It's not where we are today. And so education needs to be lifelong. There isn't anybody, whether you're a car mechanic or a doctor or a lawyer or an economist, who doesn't believe and learn that lifelong learning has to keep going on. And letting go of that little bucket for when you thought you knew everything at 22 or 25 or 30, whatever it was, it's not really functional. It doesn't help you in your job, and it doesn't help you really to work longer. The same thing about rethinking social connections and family. A lot of the work that we do is on caregiving and social support and networks. All of that changes if fertility is low, if people live longer, if people get divorced, if they have complicated families, if they move back and forth geographically. So we need to rethink that. But mostly what I'm going to talk about is rethinking work and retirement. So I was part of a Sloan Foundation group of all economists, actually, where we thought about working longer in relationship to retirement. It was all about how we were going to secure Social Security, much in the way David had talked about it, like the institution is worth saving. I don't know about the people, we just have to get there because we have to save Social Security. And at the very end of it, somebody said, actually it was David Wise, what about all the people who we aren't counting? What about all the people? You look at employment rates often. Employment rates only represent people, at least in the United States, who are looking for jobs, who want to keep thinking of themselves as employment statistics. What about all the people who fall off before? And suddenly we reframed the question. And so this is what we did from the Health and Retirement Survey. You've seen some of these. These are US employment rates across the life course. And what you see is this enormous fall off between 50 and 60 that almost everybody has pointed out. And really, all I want to point out is that it's different for men and women. Women have a different slope and then work more. The fall off is about the same. And the fall off among people with less than high school is enormous and gets down to very low levels when you look at the slopes. But the fall off among college graduates, if you look at, I don't have a pointer on this, if you look at men, college graduates, the very top one, and you see the fall off, it's pretty steep. It's pretty steep for everybody. So the period that we're most interested in, and maybe it's even a decade before, is this period. So of these people, if we look at the people who were employed between 51 and 61, 51 and 61, among those who were steadily employed in their 50s, they're really good. That's about 52% of the group. 34% of the group in the United States are intermittently employed, and about 15% are never employed. But here's the impact. 80% of the steadily employed people, which is still only 50%, right, can work between 62 and 66. Of the intermittent employment, it's not nobody, but it's 35%. And of course, if you never worked in your 50s, you have very small odds of working later. So there's no sense increasing the retirement age or thinking about the retirement age if you've already lost people. You've already lost, 80, it's 80% of the 50% who are working. So the big thing that we have to think about if we think about working longer is how come these people are not in the labor force? Like, how even are they supporting themselves during this time? And this is a pretty big mystery. So I want to say, as an epidemiologist and in public health, I totally assumed that health was the driver for why you dropped out of the workforce. I was, completely committed to looking at this hypothesis. And actually, Bertrand's data yesterday was really interesting. You used some of the same data that we are of showing the importance of worker health. And I want to say worker health is really important, but it is not the most important thing. It's hard to kind of quantify these three things ranking against each other, but working conditions turned out to be incredibly important. People who had precarious work, who had no work flexibility, who were low-wage workers, people who had to commute long distance, working conditions played an enormous role in this equation of dropping out. And the third one was the work-family interface. And I want to say we often think of this in terms of young children. It's not really young children among this group. It's older. It's their partners and spouses and their parents and aunts and uncles. It's not, so focusing only on like parental leave does not solve the problem, especially in a low fertility setting. It's a much bigger problem. So these are the three things that really account, that we've found so far, that accounted for that. So I want to show you some of the constellations. These are some of our data that look at labor force participation and what are kind of work-family strains do they predict mortality risk. So this is complicated. It's just got a lot of numbers. But it's the adjusted associations between family status and job control and mortality among women in the Health and Retirement Survey. So in the blue, for instance, is an average married mother who could have high control, medium control, low control. The average mother in a high control setting is the reference group. You can see low control, even among a married mom, is associated with an increased mortality risk. If you look at single mothers, and with low job control, it's almost double. So you put this family constellation into a precarious work setting, and the mortality rate is really high. And you can see the same thing for a single mother who was actually had children earlier. That's what that means. And long-term married mothers and later married mothers. I would say that the optimal group was to have a child, to be a married mom, have a child somewhat later, and be in a high control job. That's kind of the sweet spot, which many of us may be in, but not everybody, clearly. The other thing that I want to show you, and I hardly ever talk about happiness, mostly I talk about health, but I thought this was great, and it was also a study of OECD countries. So this is the effect of parenthood on happiness. And here are the countries where being a parent makes you happy, is associated positively with happiness. And on the other side, you see the negative ones are being a parent is negatively associated with happiness. Well, being in France, people are happy mothers, happy parents, I should say. It's actually mothers and fathers, it's parents. And you can see Portugal, Hungary, Spain, Norway, Sweden, France, Finland, all have positive associations with being a parent and being happy. And the UK, Greece, Ireland, and the United States have this very interesting distinction of being associated with unhappiness. So parents in these countries are less likely to be happy than non-parents. And part of the idea was to look at a comprehensive policy index that included work time flexibility, parental control, a whole set of parental leave, a whole set of things. And in low comprehensive policy index countries, non-parents were happier, parents were less happy. Interestingly, in high comprehensive policy index countries, both are happy. Parents and non-parents are happy. And here's just an example that looks at, this is the top one is child care cost. So it's child care cost, the dotted line is non-parents, the solid line is parents. So parents become less happy as child care cost increases, and so do non-parents, by the way, just not very strongly. And here is vacation and sick leave, where you see actually this crossover. Everybody is better off with increased sick leave and parent and vacation. So now we come to a question. I've taken you along this path that I would say it goes from descriptive to kind of causal, semi-quasi-experimental studies looking at policies without strong causal inference, to something that has a stronger causal inference about whether you can modify the work environment and produce better health outcomes. And in this study, we actually had a very, very large study. It was Work, Family, and Health Network. We did a randomized field control study of 2 industries. We looked at a group of studies that were in the IT industry and 30 long-term care settings. And we randomized the work groups, and half of them got the intervention, half of them were the control groups. We did a lot of health assessments beforehand and afterwards. I'll tell you a little bit about what the health assessment was. And I think it's important because it's a kind of proof of principle that can you change the work environment and improve health in some way? So not a policy experiment, but a very well-controlled clinical trial. And this is what we did. We trained supervisors to be more attuned to work-family balance and issues of equity and fairness. Often supervisors kind of dole out goodies, depending on whether they think you're deserving or you worked hard. Actually, it's a right, that family leave, unpaid leave in the United States is a law. Nobody understood it was a law. So we trained people to really understand how to do this with some set of equity and fairness. And then we formed employee and supervisor group team meetings to develop approaches to scheduling work practices and increase voice. So the employer and the group together came up with their own individual kind of way of being more flexible. I led the nursing home one. In the nursing home one, the policy was that we were told that it had to be safe for patients, it had to be cost neutral, like we're not giving them more benefits, and it had to be legal, like we couldn't just do anything. Nursing homes have huge regulatory kind of things, how many people have to be on the floor, how long you can work, you know, that kind of thing. So it had to fall under all of those constraints. Here are the two industries, and I want to show you what it did to IT workers, where we had more stronger effects. So it increased job satisfaction. We actually measured sleep duration with actigraphy monitors, watches. It increased the sense of having enough time. It increased schedule control, increased supervisor support for family life, adolescents' time with parents, and adolescents' handling of everyday stressors. It decreased burnout, stress, distress, work-family conflicts, plans to leave the company, which obviously made the company very happy, voluntary exits in terms of turnover, and cardiometabolic risk. Now I'm going to show you one last slide that's on the cardiometabolic risk. This is whether this is about a study that we just actually finished on these same data, looking at workplace practices in early and mid-adulthood and whether they would be associated with the development of cardiometabolic risk. So everybody in our cohort had a very large profile of cardiometabolic risk taken biologically. We took their blood pressure, we did finger sticks for glycosylated hemoglobin, we looked at cholesterol, we looked at smoking patterns there, we measured their weight. So all really biologically measured cardiometabolic risk. And here is the result. Now the result, this is a hard slide to read because it shows that basically among people who had some cardiometabolic risk, among mostly older people in their mid-40s to 50s, the intervention reduced the rate of cardiometabolic risk. So the way I say it in words is that it made you age, instead of being like 50, it made you age at the rate of a 40-year-old. That is about the thing. Everybody's cardiometabolic risk goes up in time, but the people who had cardiometabolic risk at baseline actually had a bigger effect on the intervention. Or the intervention had a bigger effect on them. So in fact, you can change workplace practices, and it can lead to reductions in cardiometabolic rate. It actually slows what we would call the rate of aging, equivalent to about a decade. It's not a trivial effect. So in terms of proof of principle, you can actually do this. So I want to just conclude with 3 principles. Social inequalities across education and gender and work and retirement are large. You can see them, but problems are widespread. Solutions need to be widespread too. One of the things that we could come back to perhaps in the discussion is the need for heterogeneity. That there's a lot of heterogeneity in these findings. It may be that different people or different working groups need to do different things. Working longer starts younger than we think. Policies to encourage delayed retirement need to address workers' need decades before traditional pension eligibility ages. Dealing with people who are in their 60s, it's like it's too late to really change that curve. So much action has happened kind of in midlife. And finally, policies affecting work and policies affecting retirement are 2 sides of the same coin. You can't delay retirement if you don't have a job to retire from. And often, at least in the United States, the people who look at retirement policies and Social Security are one set of economists, and the people who look at labor policies are labor policies, and it's not like they talk to each other. And it wasn't until the end of this whole process that people started to really engage and understand that these 2 things are just the flip sides of the same coin. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We will now proceed with our panel discussion. And I will ask Lisa, David, and Shruti to join us again for the panel discussion, and to welcome Dorothy Roget, Chief Economist at the French Treasury, where she oversees the economic and forecasting analysis determining France's fiscal and macroeconomic policy. She has pursued a career path combining the academic, applied policy, and private sectors, and has previously served as a senior economist at the OECD. Now, we have enough material to start our discussion, but just a few thoughts at the beginning. To summarize a bit what we discussed in this morning sessions. As life expectancy steadily rises and population ages, our institutions built to operate accommodating a shorter lifespan face a crucial challenge. And by being a political scientist, here the slogan is institutions matter. And as David stressed it, we have to think about institutions and policies. So this discussion is going to be dedicated to suggestions for policy implications and institutional redesign. Among others, the longevity society is not only about people living longer. Among others, it refers to reshaping how we live, learn, work, and contribute to the society's welfare across an extended lifespan. To rise to this challenge, governments, firms, communities, in general must reimagine the architecture of systems that were not designed to serve a longer lifespan. One can think of several institutions in our societies whose operation and effectiveness are drastically affected by the longer lifespans. The organization of work, educational and training schemes, pension systems, healthcare, long-term care, and preventive care systems are examples of such frameworks that should undergo structural adjustments to live up to the reality that the longevity society establishes. Effective policies governing the operation of such institutional frameworks should be put in place to address the emerging challenges. What we need is rethinking the role of states, the role of firms to support not just longer lives, but also better ones. The reforms affect all stages of the multi-stage life, and they affect in the earlier, middle stage, the career, but also elders who should be viewed as invaluable human capital with wisdom, time, and experience to put forward. To name a few challenges, one could touch on the workplace improvement, enablers for facilitating working in teams, or more apt to the concise job descriptions that contribute to a better matching of people's skills with job requirements. Another example could be offering older people who are about to enter a pension scheme the opportunity to continue working in their current role rather than having firms to recruit them again from scratch or being recruited in a role that does not match their skills. But I stop here. To deep dive into these concerns, allow me to turn to our distinguished panelists. We heard them today with the first round of their speeches, who will shed more light on these issues. We are going to have 2 rounds of questions. I will start with Lisa. Lisa, you have conducted much research for understanding the relationship between work policy and health. And just to elaborate a little bit more, based on your work, or your current work, how can firms achieve employee health improvement while boosting corporate output, which is a more specific question. So.
I think actually, I would need to. Of all the social determinants of health, I always think that work is the most modifiable. I want to say corporations change work practices all the time. They mostly do it for reasons of profitability or better business decisions, but they understand organizational change. It isn't a foreign concept. It isn't one where people ask individuals to change their behavior. They understand organizational change. So to me, it is like one of the most important areas that we could focus on, and involves both private and public kinds of policy changes. It's a place where you can ask private companies to change as well as policies. And I think having flexibility in some ways, not focusing all on early childhood, on parental leave, although I do think part of that fertility issue is completely about people who decide that they can't have children because they have to work. You know, Japan is probably, you know, the most clearest example where people feel they have to make a choice. But nonetheless, I think modifying how we work is one of the best avenues, and there are many, many examples of ways that we might go in to do that, that both involve public policy as well as private policies.
Okay, thank you. Now I turn to David. David was stressing a lot about the institutional reconstruction, let's say, to how we are going to redesign our institutions based on the findings of your work, which, according to your opinion, are the main policy challenges that will enable us to reap the expected dividend of healthy aging in terms of growth.
Yeah, so I think I was very forceful on the fact that we need to change. What we need to change to is a much harder question. And I think there, the enormous challenge, I think, is on the heterogeneity. We talked about it. I didn't have time to talk about this issue that there's enormous inequality in income, but also in health. And the inequality is worse than we think because of the incredibly high correlation between health and income. So the people who are well off are living a long time. The people who are low income are living a short time in poor health. And I think that we need to design institutions that take account of that heterogeneity. So for example, at the moment, the pension system is much more beneficial to the high income people who have long lifespans and benefit from the design of the system. But I think if you're going to make it heterogeneous, it's not just a function of age, you have to make it a function of people's characteristics, and that induces a lot of issues. So I think you know, the standard idea in economics is you want to make it a function of invariant characteristics. Once you make it a function of things people can vary, you induce incentives. But I think it's a hard problem, but I think it's one that we have to address. And essentially, it means that the policy is more complex. And it's not just retirement at a particular age. It may be a function of people's health and productivity, maybe a function of their education level, maybe a function of their asset holdings. But all of these things are possible distortions, and so we have to think hard about optimizing in a world where there is heterogeneity and distortions. I do think that we are not locked into these systems that are very simple, but the systems that may be optimal may be more complex.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I turn to Dorothy. Dorothy, in your diverse professional career path, you have focused, among others, on issues related to achieving inclusive growth in aging societies. So my first question, which I have prepared to help the discussion here, and of course we can intervene and change views. What are the main challenges that policymakers face in their effort to lift employment and productivity in aging society?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, perhaps the first thing is when you say lifting employment productivity, I think, I mean, we've had this discussion yesterday. The impact of aging on employment is fairly clear, on productivity, not so much. Probably on productivity, I mean, we have a general productivity slowdown. The part that aging is playing in that is not so simple. So there, I mean, the recipes are more general. I think we know where our challenges are in terms of productivity, in education, in fostering innovation, fostering entrepreneurship. I think where we are a bit short still in terms even of analysis and recipes is in thinking, how do we adapt our recipes in terms of boosting productivity to a world in which the average worker is older, or to a world in which the average career is longer. So we think we need to improve our education system, but we also need to think about, I mean, what are the hard and soft skills that our kids will need when they might, you know, change occupation 3 times in their lives, and we need to prepare them for that, and probably that's more of a focus on sort of soft skills and adaptability than we are doing now. The same for innovation. I mean, in some ways, a lot of this is not specific to aging. I think one question that was also touched on yesterday is what does entrepreneurship look like, I mean, and business dynamism in aging societies? I think there's this assumption that the entrepreneur is sort of this young start-upper, but older people have more resources and networks and experience, so they might be successful entrepreneurs, but may not have the information support for that. So I think it's more about rethinking our sort of cross-cutting policies in light of aging. On lifting employment, I mean, I think we've heard a lot. In some ways, we know what we have to do. The hard thing is actually doing it. I think there is a tension when we focus on extending working lives, and David has it, on between doing something that is simple and understandable. Pension systems are complex. People don't know what their rights will be. So saying, you can retire. We've had this issue in France many times, saying, you could. Minimum retirement age was 62, we lifted to 64. It's very easy. People understand it very well. They hate it. And they hate it sometimes for good reasons, because it's perceived as unfair. Not everyone is the same as 64. So it's perceived as putting a higher burden on people who started work early, who may not have had the most personally enriching careers. But on the other hand, if you make things complex, then it becomes really hard to understand. And there is the assumption that everyone will lose out. I mean, we tried a systemic pension reform, unifying all regimes, making it more flexible. It was so complicated. We tried it in 2019. Everyone was against it. There were winners and losers, but everyone thought they would be losers. So there's also this tension. I think once you start saying we need a lot of criteria, it becomes difficult. Part of the challenge there is also, and it's been said before, I mean, we don't really have a positive narrative around it in the policy circles. It is all about the disutility of work. We don't have a positive narrative about working longer, healthier, and I think this is something we've focused on. It's a good reason to focus on the 50 to 65 span, because that's where probably we have more scope to intervene. But I'm also struck by the fact that, I mean, there seem to be some differences, at least when we like to compare ourselves to Germany and France. If I look at surveys in Germany about when people want to retire, the average sort of desired age of retirement is 1 year older than the average effective year of retirement. So people, in a way, would like to, on average, of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity, would like to work longer than they actually do. In France, it's the other way around, not surprisingly. But I think there is something to do about that. Very, very quickly on the other aspects, I think, we've also talked a lot. I mean, I'm sure she has said a lot about that. But one of the main challenges is training people for longer careers, rethinking lifelong training, both to slow down skill obsolescence for people who stay in their jobs, and to enable people to move between occupation if they so wish. It's really hard to do. In terms of take-up, for instance, if we look at lifelong training, especially for older people who are unemployed, that's where you get the most bang for the buck in terms of chances, in terms of the change in employment probability that you get from the training. That's also where you have the lowest take-up training. So clearly there's something we're not doing right there. And it's the reasons that are most often cited are either because the offer is inadequate, because the training for occupational mobility tends to be more than 6 months long, working towards a certification, sort of academic, and what you really need something short, focused on experience, immediately applied. So there's work there. But also, the reasons that are most often cited are lack of support for outright rejection by the employer. So that's also where we probably need more awareness. And that's, I mean, among, I guess, the challenges, that's the last one I will cite from the governance perspectives, is a lot of the things we discuss are not really, I mean, it's not easy to see what is a public policy lever, and I'd be curious to hear more. In some ways, I mean, a lot of things are just for the employers and social partners to think about. I mean, when we think age discrimination, adapting workplaces, age-friendly working conditions, thinking about career paths for people who are in long-term employees of a firm, sort of thinking of where they will go if the firm retains them until retirement age. And governments probably have a role to play here, but frankly, they're not the main actors, and these things change slowly. So I think from the policymakers' perspective, it's also a challenge that in a way you're held accountable for, saying, well, if you want to increase working lives, then things need to happen that are slow moving and are more in the realm of the firm. But let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dorothy. Now I'm turning to Shruti. You have researched a lot on the labor market adjustments needed to respond to the demographic changes. So my first question is on how do you think that firms can best prepare to attain the benefits of the longevity society? An easy question.
Yeah, I think like Dorothy just mentioned, and Lisa said the same, that workplace settings, and I think the role of employers and corporate policies is really key here. And it's in so many ways very obvious. It's, like, as I said earlier, it's a place where we spend most of our time. It's an important determinant in terms of our decision-making, how long we stay in the workforce. It's also an important determinant of how well we will do and what quality of lives we will have after retirement. And so I think that's one area that I is still sort of underlooked into, actually, the kind of jobs that we have. What does that mean in terms of how well we age once we have really fully retired? I must say, I'm really excited. I'm going to show off a little bit here. I mean, I think for many years, the OECD has typically been focusing on public policy. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've really started to dig deeper into the role of firms and corporation. And we've been talking to a lot of large companies and small companies on understanding, the barriers that they face. But as I mentioned earlier, they are doing some really exciting work, and which I think there's something to be learned for public policy in itself. And I gave the example of the UK earlier, where actually the financial sector had totally understood that their workforce was aging very rapidly, and they need to start thinking and helping them to actually retire and plan their retirement and skills and needs and so on. And this is an example of great partnership where the UK government actually thought, this is a fantastic initiative. We're going to actually pilot this at the national level. And so they've actually taken this initiative that's born in the private sector, piloted it, and it's something innovative. And we're waiting for the results to see what that's going to look like. But that's just one area. The second is about educating the firm level, firm actors. And so here, I think sort of the terminology age management was first used by the European Commission about 40, 50 years ago. And we go around countries, and even within the public sector, people don't know what age management means. What does it mean, like age management policies? And so there's a huge lack of know-how what to do in terms of improving working conditions, making sure that employers give the right sort of working time arrangements. And oftentimes, as Dorothy mentioned, actually the issue is not so much that the policies aren't changing, regulations are changing, that they're responding. It's actually the take-up. Society, there's still a stigma at an older age or in your 50s to perhaps reduce your working hours or to work part-time, or as a woman coming back from maternity leave to do something else. And so that stigma is a huge issue. And I think this is where we need business leaders and leaders to actually step up. And we do see it in some of the large corporations, where actually to improve the take-up of some of these initiatives, that we need to sort of have sort of agents of change in this front. So I would say that I think firms are becoming extremely important. They are taking action. These are clever agencies. They're grappling with labor shortages, and some of them are actually responding and taking the issue at hand and recognizing the business case. Not, of course, not everybody understands the business case, but some large corporations do. And I think just to finish off my thoughts, it's also an important player, I think, in terms of advancing in research. When we talk about the issue of productivity and aging, in fact, the gold standard ideally would be, as economists, that we get hands-on and access to data, firm-level data, business-level data which we can really use to see what's the relationship between working conditions or aging of the workforce with productivity. In fact, the only study that I've ever seen successfully done is the case of BMW car plant about 20 years ago. And it's fantastic that BMW actually offered this data set to see and conduct some sort of a trial to look at the productivity relationship. And so I think it's an important player in all aspects in terms of improving the evidence base of some of the very important questions that we're all grappling with, but also in terms of creating change and leading in change as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now we start the second round, and we can receive also questions from the audience. The idea here is to extract as much as policy recommendations we can from your experience and focusing on the policy implications on how we redesign institutions and public policies. So again, to Liz, I have a second question, more on what is the need to redesign the organization of the work and the career paths, based again on the work that you've done on this, or you're doing on this area, in order to support the healthier aging.
Yeah. I think the implication of the career path is that it doesn't have to look like what it looks like now. Like, we don't have to pack all the heavy years of work into the years where we're raising a family and have complications in so many ways. We could spread that out. Wouldn't it be nice to take a year of retirement in the middle of one of those working years, and in exchange for working longer for another year? The idea is that that kind of flexibility is open to us, really. It's our choice. One of the things I really did want to add is just, it's peripheral, but like about prevention. And this is that we've talked a lot about prevention. People in public health always struggle with like making the case for prevention, because basically if you're really good at prevention, nothing happens. And it's a population dynamic. You individually don't know whether you didn't get the disease. You only know on a population level that things have happened. So this whole idea of prevention, which is so fundamental to healthy aging, is something that needs to be framed in a way that you understand it better. And it actually is so much easier it's so much easier to say that you have a disease and here's a pill than to say we're going to prevent COVID with vaccinations. We're going to prevent polio, measles with vaccinations, or work is going to be a preventive in the long run and will promote healthy aging for it. So I think the idea of prevention is very important, and we get used to it, but it is a very hard sell in terms of people individually feeling like they reap the benefits for this.
Thank you. David, based again on your research, you mentioned it early on, we need to redefine some concepts and to throw our lights, to shed more lights on the welfare as a concept, and to concepts such as life expectancy and the relation between the dependent rate and all these kind of things, they have to be redefined. Can you enlighten a little bit more on the to give you more chance to give us what is the alternative, to give a new content to this?
I think we need a better welfare measure. I think a problem, I've worked with philosophers on this, and what I've learned is if you want a perfect welfare measure, you're never going to get it. There's a huge philosophical debate about what human welfare is. And so what I would really push for is a better measure, but not to try for perfection. I think we need to measure income, we need to measure health, we need to measure leisure. I think there are other aspects of life. People really value respect. Actually, people value having children. But getting valuations for everything and including it in a single measure is really hard. I think we can do much better with another measure, which again will be approximate, but better than income per capita. So trying to have perfection here is a recipe for disaster. I would also say one thing I think is really lacking in the economics approach is human rights. People are very concerned about human rights. We don't have a good way of putting human rights into our welfare approach. And I actually think that a better place to talk about human rights in economics would be in the constraints. Is that we think of constraints as being resource constraints, but we might have things in our welfare approach which say there are some human rights constraints in what we do and make them really fundamental. But I think these issues around broader notion of welfare and human rights are really central, and until economics really incorporates them, we're sort of missing the point, I think, in the public policy discussion to some extent. I would like to say something else about implementation. And I think that I think one of the issues is people are quite short-term in their outlook, and we need to design policies that have a more long-term perspective. I think another really fundamental problem is that governments are short-term in their outlook. Governments, because of political pressures and elections, want gains now, not in the future. When you look at countries like Singapore, which are less electoral pressure, because they manage their democracy, they manage always to win, they have a very different approach. And so if you look at their pension system, it's fully funded. People contribute 30% of their salaries. That goes into a pot. They guarantee at least 4% return a year on that, on those savings. But it's fully funded, so there's no real sustainability problem and no intergenerational transfers. I think they have too little redistribution. They have some cohort redistribution to people who were alive prior to independence. They think those people are very poor. But it's not age-related, it's that cohort. They think that the rich people today who have earned a lot from the economic growth can take care of themselves. So I think there is this issue about moving to a longer-term perspective, and I worry a bit that democracies, because of the pressures of getting elected, aren't really well placed to do this. And I think when I talk about institutions, I don't just mean governments. I think families are very important. The private sector is very important. NGOs are very important. And we want governments may not be the right answer to this question. Because I think they're not well placed to address these sort of long-run issues, like the long-run process of population aging.
Unfortunately, democracies is, this is it's a problem that it's indigenous with democracy, because the electoral cycle is always shorter than a serious public policy reform, which takes over generation to reap the results of such a change, and then you have a problem of consistency and all. But now we move on to Dorothy with the second round question, and based again on your current work and experience, how you should prioritize reforms combining effectiveness and the financial sustainability in pension or healthcare and long care systems.
Yeah, I mean, if I had the perfect recipe for that, my life would be a lot easier. But I think, I mean, in some ways, we have to be quite practical about the reforms that improve fiscal sustainability and at the same time response to people's needs and preferences and concerns for fairness. I mean, we have that very acutely on pension reforms, because that's always where it's the most explosive. And I think there, the experiences, I mean, people do not like the idea of working longer, but I think there's a general understanding that collectively that's needed when we live longer, healthier. The details matter a lot. So, I mean, in France, we have a dual system in a way, with a minimum retirement age and career length. Which lever you pull is very different in terms of social acceptability. The age is explosive, career length is okay. And actually in the numbers that Angela showed earlier, pension expenditure is not projected to rise in France, and the reason for that is actually reforms from the 1990s that changed from indexation to wages to indexation in prices. There were no protests about that. No one, I wouldn't say no one noticed, but it didn't really raise problems in terms of political and social acceptability. And in the end, I think long-term that might be an issue because what it implies is that the fiscal sustainability relies on pensioners losing in terms of living standards compared to the rest of the population. But it's also part of the fiscal sustainability. I think where we have this problem now is when you start extending the rule for everyone, it is important to take into account the heterogeneity of situations at age 62, 64, 65. And there are two, I think we have to be practical. I mean, we've tried a number of things. We've had for a while a system where people who started work very early before age 16 or 18 or 20 could retire earlier in terms of age. We now figure out that this is actually rather anti-redistributive because people who started work early but had full uninterrupted careers are not the worst off. Therefore maybe that's too generous compared to what we're trying to do. Then you have we also have another system which is sort of trying to look over your careers whether you actually had physically arduous jobs with a number of criteria. Problem is extending that in order to qualify for early retirement means a lot of red tape for firms which have to say sort of day by day, you know, did you carry heavy loads, were you exposed to chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. So there's, but that's getting more to the matter. And in the end, when people are really against increasing the retirement age, the examples you hear are always people who had physically hard jobs and cannot realistically go on until 64. So of course, the first best option would be trying to train them to do something else when they're 45, but when they're 60, it's too late. And then you have to think of what is a system to target the exceptions to people who really need them and not just, and have some flexibility there. Just on health, I think, I mean, a lot has been said. I think the issue there is to address the surge in demand, to address the demand for also more diversified pathways, also for long-term care. Some people will want home care, some people will not. Sometimes it will be too much of a burden for the family, sometimes not, and to be flexible there too. But also adapt to the fact that a growing share of health spending is long-term chronic diseases with aging, and that puts quite a big pressure on costs. Prevention is essential. Prevention is hard to push to the top of priorities, just as I said, because if it works, then you don't see it, but the costs are immediate and the benefits are sort of diffuse, long-term, and invisible. So that's always hard, but we still have to think about how to design the medical system to incentivize it more. For instance, not compensation by intervention, but sort of based on the age of the general health status of the patient.
Thank you much, Dorothy. Thank you very much, Dorothy. And my last question to Shruti. Again, on your experience and your current work, please give us some recommendations for potential policy reforms that they will be required to obtain an efficient lifelong learning framework.
Well, these are by no means my recommendations, but the OECD has done a lot of work on promoting lifelong learning, several years and several reports, which for those who are interested, I encourage you to dig into. But I think when it comes to older workers, we often think about training as something expensive, something that has to be very long, and often really doesn't meet the expectation or the needs of mature workers. It doesn't have to be. Actually, a lot of older workers, and a lot of evidence suggests that, are already very experienced. And so it's not so much about, getting them to participate and upskill and reskill. Yes, for some of them that would be important, but for others, it's things about certifying their skills that they've learned over the job over the last 20, 30 years. And that can be a cost-effective way of acknowledging the skills and the transferable skills that people can take from one job to another. An interesting example on that is that a few years ago, Japan had something called the skills passport. And the passport was really about documenting the skills you've acquired on the job. Wasn't hugely successful because employers don't like things that are too burdensome for them. And so I think in response of that and keeping in mind that sort of some of these administrative processes can be costly for employers, a lot of the governments are now responding and having national level-based skill certification systems, which I think are really the way forward for especially this age group. The second thing is, which is under research and unfortunately not lots of good evaluation, are things around reverse mentoring and mentorship programs. Again, I think in an aging society, given where older people have lots of experience to share with their younger individuals, these schemes, they make sense and employers are doing it, but unfortunately in a rather unstructured way. And so could we be thinking about policies and I think be innovative around sort of doing things in a more formal way? I mean, I don't want to sort of be too dogmatic on that. I think there's some beauty about the private sector sort of taking ownership and creating, we don't want to be too prescriptive in telling what the private sector to do, but I think there is definitely more need of evaluation of these programs, but also perhaps some sort of nudge and some support system to actually encourage a more systematic approach encouraging this. Again, in the UK, just and I think last year, the government had announced a returnship program. Many older workers had left, so following COVID, inactivity rates had gone sort of enormously large number of older people left the labor market, and actually something called the returnship program was created to get this experience back into the labor market, experienced workers, and actually help them to work in their own way, but actually get that tacit knowledge back into the company level as well. So, and I think there are things like, without, goes without saying, it doesn't, it's things like even the names of these programs. I mean, do we want to call apprenticeships for older workers, for instance? It's something that's designed for young people and perhaps puts off a lot of older people in participating in these sort of programs. And so I think it's also about communication. It's about making sure the design is adaptable to the needs of older workers. It's not classroom-based, it's modular. I think this is where micro-credentials are taking off big time in lots of countries, making sure that actually not only older workers, but sort of many of the groups that have difficulty in reconciling working and training at the same time, which is quite a big task. How can we make it actually flexible and easy for everyone? So just a few thoughts on that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Before we close, I don't know if there are any questions, but okay, I will take some questions. And with Vivian?
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Just one question. I mean, I do agree that the share of pension is the most important in terms of age-related expenditure. At the same time, long-term care is the most fast-rising component of age-related expenditure. So I think that in this case, emphasis should be given really from moving from institutional to home care, because which could provide a combined care at home in terms of nursing and social care. Many studies, OECD studies as well, have shown that this will reduce the cost of long-term care, and in addition, it would meet really the preferences of older people, that they would prefer to stay at home when they get older. At the employment, regarding the employment of older workers, I do agree that the three components that it's more what needs to be done is to improve incentives, to improve employability, and also to improve the demand side, which I do find that it's the three components that can really improve lengthen the working lives. At the same time, we are focusing mainly on what firms can do and how can they adjust. However, some very important elements and inflexibilities, for example, the compulsory retirement age, you see that many countries is also at the public sector. So I think that it should be really an approach that not only some flexibility, as I said, as the mandatory retirement age, should also start being removed also from the public sector and, of course, private sector in order to be able to boost the participation. Thank you.
Okay, let's take all the questions because Professor Tsakloglu and, okay, yeah, please go ahead.
Hello? Okay, it works. I have one comment and one idea to provide. Most of the discussions and points were associated with the things that we know best, and these are the older people. The challenge, and going back to Andrew's book, is how do we prepare the younger generations for what they will have to face? I do not know if we have statistics. I do not know if we know how to treat that. And this is, I think, the big challenge that we're facing in relation to longevity. Now, we have to work with things that we have in our hands, otherwise creating new structures, new policies, and things like that perhaps may lead to nothing. Just imagine the Boy Scout movement, or the Scouting movement, because it's not just boys, they're Girl Scouts. Okay? How were they created? What are they doing now? What do they offer? They're basically for youth. Imagine a scouting system that brings youth and older people together to meet every so often, to change views, to change ideas, to work in the intergenerational aspects on all the multiple facets of what longevity brings: technology, respect, human rights, civic education, all those other things. Now, we have to try to imagine things like that and then encourage them to put them together and go down to the roots, the local governments, the communities. This is what happens in Australia, for example. The people are working together, and they have much better relationships within a community than we do in Greece here. This is what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. I have a small question regarding a minor point of Lisa Bergman's presentation. However, it's a major point for me, so I'm raising it. I feel very uncomfortable whenever I hear that women do not have children because they work. Because, first, I don't think it's true. Because, at least in Europe, we have the Mediterranean paradox, where economies with very low labor force participation of women have very low fertility. And within these countries, those who have children are those who work. So I understand that there is an argument regarding greedy work and standards of all-day working that are completely inhumane, let alone child hostile. But this cannot be packaged as work that makes women not want to have children, because it can become toxic, especially in traditional patriarchal societies.
Okay. First of all, two comments on David Koenig's presentation. Let me disagree completely with your statement that economists are using as a welfare indicator GDP per capita out of intellectual laziness. In fact, there is a huge, enormous literature on finding alternative welfare indicators there. All this literature comes to two problems. One is the problem of selection. Most of them are arguing on multi-indicator indices and so on. The first is selection. What do we put there? Do we put longevity? Do we put education? Do we put freedom? Or all these kind of things. Second, it is a question of weighting. Do all these factors have the same thing? However, the resilience of GDP per capita and especially monotonic transformations of GDP per capita, like log GDP per capita, because the differences are far smaller there, lies somewhere else mainly. All these other indicators are almost all of them strongly statistically correlated with GDP per capita. Therefore, it is not that it is such a good indicator as such that it's a proxy for all these other things. The second observation, you mentioned there, and I think that this is, I'm very sympathetic to this view. Let's move away from the statutory retirement age and make, let's say, more flexible arrangements. Yes. All these demonstrations in France, and even more so in this country, were not about more flexible arrangements, were for the retainment of the same benefits, despite the fact that we have an increase in longevity, and if it is possible to have an earlier retirement with the same benefits. This is what they were arguing for. Therefore, this is a completely different kind of an argument than the one that was presented. In fact, you made a very good argument in the panel discussion now. However, I'm very pessimistic that this will never take root in the public discourse or in public action. Are we prepared to say that women must have lower pensions than men for equal contributions because on average they are living 4 years more than men? Are we prepared to say that better educated workers must have lower pensions because they are living longer? In fact, in these papers that you mentioned there, I was expected to see, there is a very eloquently entitled paper by Land Pritchett and Larry Summers saying, welfare is healthier. This is precisely the thing. Are we prepared to go in this way? I do not think that in any public discourse I have heard arguments like that. And finally, a short comment on Shruti Singh's paper. Shruti, lifelong learning is a form of training. It is an investment in human capital. And like all investment, time horizon plays an important role. Therefore, irrespective of the policies that I'm very sympathetic to your argument as well, we will always observe this distance in the type of training, amount of training that older workers are receiving vis-à-vis younger workers. Because younger workers have a far longer time horizon to exploit this investment than older workers.
Now, before we close, just to make an announcement that, okay, first I would like to extend my thanks to all the today's speakers and participants, but we had something like more than 800 attendees and online to our event, which is a quite impressive number, I guess, the 2 days. 500 yesterday and 300 today. Now, to conclude today's discussions and to reflect on the themes we have explored, I'm delighted to invite once again Andrew Scott to share some final thoughts with us.
Well, I'd like to say very much, one of the things we've learned in the last day and a half one of the things we've learned the last day and a half is how valuable the extra time that comes with a longer life is, and that implies how valuable your time is right now. So I won't say a great deal. Personally, I've been delighted with this inaugural event of the Research Policy Network. I find this a fascinating topic, but of course one of the things about longevity is it covers everything. So bringing together people with a range of perspectives and a range of thoughts, I think has been great, because there's a lot to learn from one another as we get to better answers. It's also a topic that is relevant for every country. Every country has an aging population. Every country is seeing an increase in its life expectancy. So it's brilliant to get together this international group, both to start to sort of raise the agenda, but also to learn. We're experimenting. We need to rethink institutions. We don't have answers. We've got to find out pretty quickly what works and what to do. So bringing together a range of institutions, I think, has been wonderful, and I think the beginnings of something we can really build on. It's also a really important topic, of course. And I'd like very much what Dorothy said today. As the person who's running a research network, she said it's been a great event for really sort of thinking through what the issues are and what we need to do. We just need to come up with answers of how to do it. So from a research policy point of view, I'm going to be rather indulgent and say that's a great start. I just want to thank all the speakers, also the audience who have listened very patiently and attentively to what has been said. I want to thank the team on the ground who have made this an uneventful event, which is always a good thing. I want to thank Delphi, and I want to thank Alvaro and Felice in particular for the sterling work that they put in to make this happen. And thank you. We haven't solved the problem, but I think we've got it in our sights. And please keep an eye out for future events of the Research Policy Network, as well as Delphi and the OECD. So thank you very much.
I didn't give you a chance to give an answer.
I'm going to talk to her.
Anyway, I'm sorry.